Thank you, Nova. Just had to unmute myself. So, hi everyone. It's really great to be part of this fantastic event. Again, I've been lucky enough to attend in person over a couple of years, and just want to recognise how great it is and the efforts of everybody involved to actually run the event again this year, despite the challenging circumstances we find ourselves in. I manage the, as Nova just said, the Savanna Agriculture and Soil team. So we look after all of the ERF projects that come in under methods in those groups. And I'm joined by my colleague Shakir, who is from the economic analysis team. We're going to try and squeeze into the single frame as well. And on behalf of Shakir, myself and the Clean Energy Regulator, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending and watching today. So I count myself very fortunate to be involved in Savanna burning from the government side of things. I believe it's a real success story for all involved. It has so many benefits that go well beyond the carbon that we're reducing. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the developments we've seen in the ERF over the past year, and Shakir is going to give you some insights on what we're seeing around Savanna burning accus. So I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, so just for in terms of a general update. So Savanna burning is a significant contribution to carbon abatement and to the Emissions Reduction Fund. So we've got 78 registered projects under Savanna burning methods. And those 78 projects have achieved and avoided emissions of over 8 million tonnes. That's almost 10% of the actual emissions reduction that the Emissions Reduction Fund has achieved to date. They've been a significant player in carbon abatement contracts as well. So they're the contracts that the government enters into to purchase Australian carbon credit units. With over $150 million committed to Savanna burning related contracts. So in 2020, we saw 4 new Savanna burning projects registered, and that was up on numbers from 2019. And 3 of the 4 of those are Indigenous run projects. And that's a trend that we have seen over the last few years, that increasingly the new projects that that are coming on board are Indigenous run projects. The 4 new projects, interestingly, have a combined area of over 3.5 million hectares. So just, highlighting the scale of some of these projects is enormous. And there's a combined estimate just from those 4 new projects of over 1 million accus over their crediting period. Also last year, we issued approximately 1.44 million accus. That's actually over the 2019-2020 financial year. And just wanted to, just commend the industry for managing so well. We know very well that there's a change in conditions that Savanna burning projects are now needing to deal with changes in the climate, making conditions a lot tougher. And then last year you had the added challenges of COVID. So yeah, really to be commended for managing so well through those changes. So last year you may have heard there were also some changes in terms of the government agencies and roles around the Emissions Reduction Fund. So the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, or DISA. So previously they were responsible for all policy and legislation related to the scheme, and that included the responsibility for the development, review and amendment of methods and all legislation related to the scheme. and the CER was responsible for the administration of that legislation and policy. But last year, the government announced a shift in the roles where the CER now has the additional responsibility for method development and management. And that includes servicing the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which is the independent party that makes recommendations to the Minister regarding methods. So included in the handover of that method development function is a very ambitious target to get method development time down to under 12 months. So anybody who's been involved in the scheme for some time would know that in the past, methods have taken several years usually to get up and running. So we're looking at ways to use co-design and different method approaches to try and achieve that target. DISA, or the department, will still look after legislation changes and they'll remain active in policy that supports the ERF. And they'll also manage the consultation regarding new methods and recommending new methods to the Minister. Just some other activity currently going on that is probably of interest. The department is working with the CSIRO and Charles Darwin University to develop a full cam based modelling of Savanna burning emissions, which will actually have the capacity to bring in the increased carbon sequestered in the living biomass. So this is full cam, for those who don't know, is the calculation tool that's used to model Australia's greenhouse gas emissions from the land sector. So this is a really exciting development and has great potential. So as you might know, the current Savanna sequestration method includes calculation of the carbon that's sequestered in debris. So this work has the potential to be able to include any increase in carbon stored in the living vegetation as a result of the fire management activities. So there's some pilot studies underway and they're showing potential for significant abatement increases. And now actually making that active in a method would require a new method which was based around full cam. And so later this year, the department will call for submissions to set the next round of method development priorities. And they intend to actually set those priorities around September, October this year. So do keep an eye out if you've got an interest in providing some information to the department to help inform what the priorities for new methods might be. Do keep an eye out for the call for consultation. And lastly, we have an auction coming up. So auction 12 will be held on the 12th and 13th of April. So to participate in auction 12, you have to have a registered project that isn't yet attached to a carbon abatement contract. If you want to register a new project to bid for a contract in this auction, you have to make sure your project registration application is received by midnight Thursday, the 18th of February. If you're not quite ready for this auction, don't worry. We generally hold a minimum of 2 a year, so there'll definitely be more opportunities coming over. One thing, if you're not already aware, the CER introduced option to deliver contracts last year and the take-up was very strong. And these contracts actually allow you to bid for a contract. So it will give you the right to sell your ACCUs to the government, but not the obligation. So it provides some flexibility if you find another opportunity in the market, which is going to be more beneficial for your business, then it actually gives you the flexibility to not sell those ACCUs under that contract to the government. There's more information about those option to deliver contracts on the website. So that was it for me in terms of a general update on the ERF and Savanna burning activity. I'm going to hand over to Shakir now to talk about what they're seeing in terms of ACCUs and Savanna burning.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to the forum for the opportunity to present. As Karen mentioned, my name is Shakir Rahman. I work in the Economic Analysis section at the Clean Energy Regulator. The economic analysis section, our role is to provide data analysis to the carbon offset and renewable energy certificate market to support the market and make sure that the markets run efficiently. So in that capacity, I'm just going to give you a quick update on the ACCU market with a focus on Savanna burning projects. All right, so the first slide I have here shows ACCU supply by different method type over years. So as you can see, the Savanna burning section there is shown in that really light gray segment there in the column chart. So as you can see, Savanna burning counts for, is actually the third highest supply of ACCUs into the market. To date, 8.3 million ACCUs, Savanna burning ACCUs have been issued, which represent about 9 to 10% of the total supply of 88 million as at end of 2020. The market share of Savanna burning credits have been going up, and it peaked in 2018 with about 15%, but has since fell a little bit, reaching about 7 to 8%, averaging 7 to 8% in the last couple of years. So let's have a look at the supply in a bit more detail. So this graph here shows the number of projects that have been registered and the volume of ACCUs that have been issued to Savanna burning projects over the life of the scheme. So as you can see, the line graph here shows the number of projects. As you can see, the number of projects registered sort of peaked really early on, reaching 26 project registration in 2014, and has since sort of come down, averaging about 4 projects per year since 2017. And this is reflected in the supply of ACCUs. As you can see, started off slowly, but then ramped up fairly quickly, reaching over 1 million in 2015, and then reaching a peak of 1.9 million in 2018. And has since moderated a little bit. We got about 1.3 million ACCUs issued to Savanna burning projects last year in 2020. As for future supply, we have 78 projects, as Karen mentioned. 62 of those projects are currently generating ACCUs, and 16 are yet to be credited. So if these projects start generating ACCUs, then the supply might increase a little bit. But in the absence of new project registration or a new method development, again, as Karen mentioned, we don't expect the supply of ACCUs to grow significantly in the near future. Okay, so let's have a look at where those ACCUs are going. So this graph is looking at the demand for Savanna burning ACCUs. So as you can see early on, they have been delivered against the carbon pricing mechanism, and more recently, a bulk of them have been used to deliver against ERF contracts. But more interesting is the voluntary cancellation segment, which is shown in yellow here. As you can see, in 2016-17, it was a small portion of the market share, but it has grown significantly in the recent years. In 2018, 19, 20, it really makes up the bulk of over half of the voluntary cancellation there. Just to give you a number, so it has grown from 2% in 2017 to about 40% in 2020. So it's a pretty significant growth there. So just to unpack that and to see that in the context of voluntary cancellation in the whole. So if you look at this graph, this is showing voluntary cancellation of all ACCUs over the years. And as you can see, there's a general trend, upward trend of voluntary cancellation, and that is being backed by corporate ambitions to reduce their emissions, which is something that we think will continue to grow. So Savanna burning here is shown in the dark blue segment there. As you can see, they make up a major portion of those surrenders. So up to date, 52%, so more than half of the voluntary cancellation units come from Savanna burning units. So there's definitely a market opportunity to grow further there, and the market values these units because of their co-benefit. So co-benefit benefit they provide to our Indigenous community. So there's definitely demand for those units. I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen and Shakir, for your wonderful presentations. Next up, our next speaker is John Connor, who was the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute, the carbon industry's peak body. John is a qualified lawyer, bringing over 25 years experience working on public and business policy with a focus on climate, sustainability and development issues. John is well known across Australia from his previous decade-long role as the CEO of the Climate Institute, overseeing its focus on national policy, institutional investor, and international climate diplomacy. Most recently, John managed the Fijian government's COP23 presidency, providing strategic, logistic, and policy support functions as Fiji presided over the UNFCCC negotiations. Please welcome our next speaker.
Thank you, Noah, and thank you for pronouncing all those acronyms and other things right. A big welcome to everyone, and again, sorry that we can't be there in person. I want to acknowledge country. I'm coming from Gadigal country here today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Special thanks also to Anna and the Icin team of putting on this under extraordinary circumstances, and really it's terrific to be part of that and to share some insights into the marketplace that we're seeing. I want to take a bit of a helicopter view and on the broader industry, and thank Karen and Shakir for that presentation. But let me just share my screen. While that's happening, I think that is now screen sharing. It is indeed. So thank you for that. So the Carbon Market Institute, we're an industry association of companies and business leading the transition to net zero emissions. We've now got almost 100 members right across the value chain in the carbon business, from those that are delivering the reduction activities, including Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, Icin, KLC, ILC, and Alpha and others, all the way through to the big emission intensive companies who are doing some of the purchase, and the whole community of those giving advice and investment direction there. We are an industry association. We're also a champion of a steward of carbon markets, and I'll talk later to our world-leading carbon industry code of conduct, amongst other things. But we're also a champion of the Paris Agreement and the challenges of getting to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is net zero emissions, but trying to avoid warming of 1.5 degrees, and indeed trying to keep it well below 2 degrees. You might have heard a lot of talk about net zero, and there's a bit of a fuss about this as a target in Canberra at the moment, but the reality is the climate crisis we have now, the global warming that we're having of over 1 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, coming from the extra carbon that's going into the atmosphere from industrial and other activities, and agricultural activities included in particular, and trapping that warmth and driving that. So the task is to get to net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. And the big task, though, also is that we're going to need to have negative emissions beyond 2050. And so the importance of land sector contributions from agriculture is going to be ongoing if we set the markets and elements up right. Now, that comes into two sort of broad definitions: avoided emissions, and this is where Savanna is in the avoided emissions, but also in the negative emissions. And It's avoided emissions in stopping some of the extra greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere because of the burning regimes, but we're also seeing, as Karen was talking, increases in biomass and the others in terms of negative emissions, capturing carbon in debris and biomass, and so it's a win-win proposition on those fronts. So this is really important background just to bear in mind about this and why we're doing it and where we're heading. To drive some of that, we're seeing governments around the world are putting in place carbon markets, encouraging the buying and selling, either through encouraging companies to buy it or even the government's buying it. And so we see a range of carbon markets emerging around the world. There's some 60 carbon market instruments, and which covers 20% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So those markets are growing, but still got a long way to go. Many of them are pretty small, and many of them have undesirable features and room to improve. Australia in particular has a bit of room to improve. We've got a compliance market under what's called the safeguard mechanism, where some of our biggest polluters, emitters, have some baselines and need to purchase to keep below that baselines, but that's pretty small. You might have seen this very small bar in some of the presentations there for the Clean Energy Regulator, and there's no real guidance in terms of direction at the moment. We think that that can be enhanced. However, we do have under the Emissions Reduction Fund, the government running a carbon market and purchasing emissions reductions, and you've seen Savanna's role in that in the presentation from Karen and Shakir. They also highlighted that there's a voluntary market afoot and showed some growth figures there. And that's from companies who are seeking to be carbon neutral or offset even some of their products, so maybe your gas or your electricity offer. And so we are seeing globally the increase there in voluntary carbon market activity, and you don't need to really look at the numbers and the details, but we are seeing here, and one thing that's worth noticing is that there are different ways in which these are being accredited and registered worldwide, and we're seeing increasing activity, and Microsoft just did a significant purchase recently with a few other accreditors and registries being formed. Let's say, don't worry about too much about the small detail there, but I think the big picture they've been highlighting, and is in the recent task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, is saying we've got to increase this some 15 times by 2030, and that might be up to $50 billion in the voluntary markets alone, let alone those in the compliance markets. So there's big opportunities there for yourselves and for the industry if we do it right and do it well. So the growing corporate interest there, just to touch on that, companies are recognising the inevitability of net zero emissions. They're being pushed by investors, their shareholders, and consumers. And so we're seeing a greater range of long-term action plans being developed and expected, and a real race there on branding of net zero emissions. And interestingly, also negative emissions, coming back to that earlier slide. So with Microsoft, Stripe, and others are talking more and more about the reality in front of us is to actually be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere in net terms to be negative emissions for decades beyond 2050 after we get to net zero emissions. And so we need ways to value the carbon and to value the carbon reduction. And we've seen even Elon Musk just in the last couple of days putting up $100 million prizes for ways in which to generate carbon removal at scale, the negative emission technologies. So we're going to see more and more of that, more and more complex voluntary market engagements. And so there's going to be a lot of excitement, but also I think a lot of tension as we work through the issues around transparency, how we're going to label this stuff, how are these fair income reductions, and so some scrutiny which is important and valid, in which we're going to need to be able to respond to. Obviously, and part of the reason we're here, part of that interest is in particular looking at the interest in nature-based or land-based climate solutions. And it's not just savanna, it's forestry and revegetation, agriculture, mangroves, and seagrasses, so what they call blue carbon. And within this is also soil carbon, which is getting a lot of attention from corporates and also the federal government in particular right now. But we're seeing companies and companies who are some of our members being very much involved in this. So Shell spending 300 million over the next 3 years. BP, Combank, NAB, other banks are getting engaged with this and setting up trading desks and the like. Woodside is another one. It's made a significant investment with Greening Australia. So there's a significant interest in these land-based solutions, which need to play a part alongside the decarbonisation, the actual industrial decarbonisation, for us to get to net zero emissions. Just wanted to highlight right now around the world in terms of the actual government markets and our own spot markets, some of the prices that are out there. And you'll see right there on the right-hand side of the screen is the European emissions trading scheme going very robustly at the moment, and we're seeing big increases also in New Zealand and other markets that are there as they begin to tighten up their markets. The European one's an interesting one because under the previous carbon pricing mechanism, there was discussions about linking with the European scheme, and so arguably they're the kind of benefits and prices that could have been being picked up by quality carbon reduction credits in that market. In Australia at the moment, though, the dominant buyer is the government through the Emissions Reduction Fund. We saw the last auction average around $15.74. We're seeing a spot market there being picking up with companies doing some compliance, locking in some bids in advance. And we know that Savanna is trading at a bit of a premium, particularly because of the extra stories that can be told around the co-benefits of Indigenous benefits, but environmental benefits as well. So that's a premium, that's a benefit for the Savanna industry. As I mentioned, the co-benefits is a really important part of this, and I think, and we're doing some work on this at the Carbon Market Institute this year. So looking at how we can integrate some of these frames, but you know, that premium that you have there, Savanna, is a demonstration of why this matters. But we're also seeing mechanisms and governments, state governments, looking to purchase those premiums and extra co-benefits. And so Queensland just did its land restoration fund and purchasing those, and they've recognised credit assessment and verification frameworks such as that from the Aboriginal Carbon Fund and Accounting for Nature and Green Collar and South Pole in those processes. Again, we're going to need to do this well. There are a range of frameworks emerging. We've got to make sure we do this well with credibility and integrity. And so that's work we've got some ongoing this year. One of the ways that CMI also is trying to drive that credibility and integrity, we've got the world's first carbon industry code of conduct, trying to define best practice and make sure that those operating in this industry are giving the right guidance to farmers and landholders and are doing the right thing by eligible interest holders, including native title holders and banks and others. So our current range of signatories and participants you'll see there in front of you. So these are companies which are committing to this extra value and extra integrity processes. We have an annual reporting process. You can check that on our website. We are moving from 2 years of setting this up to be fully operational from 1 July. So we are in that process, consulting and engaging with the community there about how we might strengthen that, how we might expand that. And there are important discussions there around the eligible interest holders, including the native title issues and free, prior and informed consent that we'll want to be talking with you and the stakeholders in the industry. So that's a bit of an overview from us, and happy to take some questions on that, and good luck for the rest of your forum.
Thank you very much, John, for your time in presenting today. Next up, we have Anna Boustead, is an environmental communications and policy specialist with 15 years experience in the Indigenous land management and community environment sector across North Australia, including roles with NALSMA, Environment Centre NT and Landcare NT. Anna is particularly passionate about supporting efforts to address climate change and recognising the incredible work by Indigenous land managers to manage their country. This brought Anna to her most recent role as the coordinator of the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network, supporting knowledge, sharing and networking across Indigenous organisations engaged in the carbon industry. It's wonderful to have Anna here in the studio with me for her wonderful presentation, which we're looking forward to. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Nova, and thanks everybody for dialing in today and participating in the forum. And I just wanted to also just say a special thanks to Nova Peris, who for 10 minutes or so from the Indigenous carbon industry side, and just wanted to acknowledge all the really interesting figures and trends that John and Karen pointed out. So I'll be referring to some of those, but slightly different perspective. Just to begin with, in case you aren't aware, the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network is a broader network of Indigenous organisations engaged in the carbon industry. We have around 34 Indigenous organisations on our network across North Australia, and we also have a broader network of about 500 people. Currently, we're joint funded by the governments across the north with additional support from the Nature Conservancy, and we're really grateful for the Nature Conservancy support of the forum over the next couple of days. So I'm employed in a 0.8 capacity 4 days a week, and I'm really pleased to announce that we've just also brought on Ben Gertz as the communications officer, and he'll be working 3 days a week based out of Townsville. Our purpose is to enable and empower Indigenous carbon producers and traditional owners of carbon projects to benefit from carbon markets through their land and sea management practices by supporting an active network of Indigenous carbon businesses and supporting agencies. And we're currently going through a governance process with our members, and we hope to create the network as an independent body within this year, and we're just working through consultations with our members over the next 6 months on that. But here you can see our objectives below. Importantly, we also now have a website, which was launched just a few months ago. And again, we're grateful to the Nature Conservancy for funding this project, but also to the Carbon Market Institute for supporting the launch of the website, which is www.icin.org.au. And it's a really great resource for Indigenous organisations, but also for any other organisations that are interested in finding out more about Indigenous carbon projects, and also, they can also connect with individual projects because they have a profile on the site through the network. And we also have resources and news to keep everyone up to date and informed. We host the annual 2020 Fire Forum, and these are some of the pictures from last year where we were able to meet face to face. It was a fantastic event over 3 days, and yeah, it's always a really great way to bring everybody together to share knowledge about Savanna fire management. And just to recap, the Indigenous carbon industry, it's a major emerging industry, and it's really interesting to see the figures that that Karen presented about the demand for Savanna burning carbon credit units, and it's very telling. It shows just how desirable these carbon credits are on the marketplace, and that's really in recognition of the substantial co-benefits that these projects deliver through to the environment and communities, and because of the Savanna carbon farming through the process of Savanna burning and bringing people back to country, and also the environmental benefits, not only from the carbon, the avoidance of emissions, but also through other benefits to biodiversity. There are other methods that Indigenous organisations are engaging with. The main one at the moment is the human-induced regeneration method, which is brought about through the removal of cattle from country to support the regeneration of vegetation. And there are increasingly a large amount of interest in that area, and we've seen a huge growth, particularly in Western Australia, in human-induced regeneration projects. And that's a significant, presents a significant opportunity, but also some risks, potential risks for Indigenous groups in that region. And it's just really important that groups are aware of that opportunity, and also that carbon companies are actively engaging with Indigenous groups. Oh, sorry, just to also highlight, there are two main carbon methods. One is the emissions avoidance methods, which most groups are using, which is basically counting the carbon that is saved through doing early dry season burning, but also avoiding hot late dry season fires through repression and suppression, sorry, and that from that on an annual basis, groups are able to generate carbon credits. The other method is called the sequestration method, which is counting the carbon that's essentially stored in logs or sticks on the ground. And that is significant because that's a longer term method and a longer term commitment of either 20 or 100 years. So in the current state of the Indigenous carbon industry, there's over 32 Indigenous owned and operated Savanna fire projects, and enabling improved Indigenous fire management over a vast area of Northern Australian Savanna. And it's abating around 6 million tonnes of emissions since 2012 and generating around $20 million each year. And I'm sure you heard Marion refer to that in her keynote presentation yesterday, just how significant the flow-on benefits of that are. And also significantly, 73% of carbon credits produced by the Savanna fire emissions avoidance method are generated by Indigenous carbon businesses. And there are, this is also providing hundreds of jobs on country for Indigenous land managers. And these are some of the same figures that that Karen and presented in her presentation. I've just cut them a slightly different way, and it shows the differences across the 3 states. And you can see that in the NT, there's been a large amount of carbon credits generated by Indigenous owned projects, and slightly different picture in Queensland and WA. But on the other hand, there's a lot more projects in Queensland and less projects, but across a bigger area in Northern Territory. Earlier referring to the additional benefits attached to these carbon credits, which for the most part are the main reason why Indigenous organisations want to engage in the carbon industry. And they include the training and employment opportunities that are derived from this, but also the environmental, cultural and social benefits from caring for country and improved biodiversity outcomes of global significance. And as John referred to, there's now a number of frameworks for measuring these. We did a survey of our members in 2019, which revealed these were some of the key areas for investment of revenue from carbon projects, which is evidence of the flow-on effect and the way that benefits are multiplied in the Indigenous carbon industry. And all of our members reported that carbon projects directly increased their capacity. The industry also supports knowledge sharing through networks such as the ICIN. This is a picture of the Mimal Women Rangers at the forum last year. We also put in policy submissions on issues of interest to the Indigenous carbon industry, and we work with our members to deliver those and to advocate for better policies to support the Indigenous carbon industry. That includes also advocating for resourcing of the North Australia Fire Information Service, which, and you heard from Rowan yesterday presenting those latest figures, and that's the critical service that underpins the entire industry. And we did successfully advocate for some short-term funding, but it remains to be seen whether long-term funding will be committed. And significantly, the NAFI team have reported that Savanna carbon farming does drive better fire management outcomes, and there's clear evidence of this through the analysis they did last year, looking back over analysing the fire regime over the 6 years more recently compared to the 6 years from 2000 to 2006. The other key issue that our industry has also had to deal with, like everybody else, COVID had a significant impact on the industry, but fortunately most groups were able to successfully carry out their savanna burning, and critical to that was the support of governments and land councils, as well as the resourcing of outstations and ranger stations, which provided groups the opportunity to isolate staff or isolate pilots as needed. Another outcome, and we heard from Julian yesterday talking about the Cape York fire management, another outcome was that there was generally more reliance on aerial burning and less ground burning. There's a lot of development. This is a very fast-moving space. There's a lot of activity in the carbon method development area. And one of those, a significant part of that is the living biomass method that the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research team are developing. And that could multiply the recognised carbon benefits from fire management by up to 5 times. We're just working through some, and I know the regulator and all the scientists are working very hard on how that will come together, and yeah, really look forward to seeing the outcomes of that scientific work. The other thing that's really happening a lot in the Indigenous carbon industry is supporting greater communication across our groups, across the network, and supporting knowledge sharing. This is a very fast moving industry, and it's also very complex. So it's really important that groups have the opportunity to share information. Also important to note that some groups are just starting in their journey in the carbon industry, whereas others have a lot of experience and have been doing it for a long time. So supporting exchanges between those groups is a really great way to enhance our overall capacity. And we had a Sharing Your Fire Story workshop at the Territory NRM conference last year. And that workshop, groups highlighted and elders and rangers highlighted the cultural importance of fire management, and that is the key driver of their Savanna fire projects. And this is a picture of the firebird that with Annette Miller and the Mimal Women Rangers that they presented at the workshop to talk about the significant cultural significance of the firebird story and maintaining, looking after country through fire management. There's some major opportunities arising, and I think John has touched on nearly all of these. But critical in that is the need to support more Indigenous groups to understand the opportunities and risks of engaging in the carbon market, and also need to support greater recognition of Indigenous rights and interests in carbon. And we're very pleased that the Carbon Market Institute has endorsed the free, prior and informed consent guidelines that ICIN published. And we encourage all corporates and governments to refer to this in their policies and in their business activities. Thank you for having me today. If you have any questions, there are my contact details. And I look forward to chatting with John and Karen as well. I'll hand back over to Nova in case any questions have come through.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. We did have a couple of questions that have come through. I think this has come through from the KLC, and it's to Karen. To what extent will CER ensure that the front end of full CAM-based accounting and reporting for Savanna projects continues to be workable and accessible for Indigenous proponents, in particular similar to SAVBAT at the moment?
Thanks. I did just pop a response in the chat, and I would say it's very early days and there's actually nothing official regarding a new method yet. But what I would say is we're acutely aware of, how capacity has been built around using existing tools through SAVBAT. I would say it's almost even too early to say whether or not SAVBAT could well continue, and actually it might be an integration with full CAM or something like that. So we really don't know what it's going to look like, but we understand that we would absolutely have to engage with users and understand what sort of transition support would be needed to make sure that it is able to be used easily by others and by those who are currently using the existing methods.
Okay, thank you for that. And another question here from Polly. It says, to what extent does a voluntary surrender of ACCUs impact on Australia's progress towards its target? And is there a need for the CER to become more competitive in the purchase of ACCUs to avoid too many units diverting to the voluntary market? Who wants to answer that one?
It's probably, that's really a question around the policy of the ERF, and it's not really something that I can give an answer on. Sorry, that's more in the department's Bailiwick. I do know that the CER is, we're certainly welcoming a more diverse and more depth to the market for ACCUs and more purchasers coming on board. And I think the release of the option to deliver contract last year is a recognition of that actually the more people we have buying ACCUs, the better it is in terms of the generation of ACCUs and bringing on supply. But in terms of impact on the target and policy positions around that, that's probably something that we'd have to get somebody from the department to give you some information on. Sorry, I know that sounds really bureaucratic.
You don't want to contribute to anything for that, Anna, or?
Yeah, sorry, I can't really comment on that either. It's an Australian government policy. But yeah, except to say that there's obviously a huge demand on the voluntary market, which indicates that more and more corporates are recognising the need to go carbon neutral and to offset their pollution, and that it would be great to see that more reflected more in Australian government policies.
Can I jump in there? Paul, it's a good question, and it's actually one that's pretty live at the moment as they work out the rules under the Paris Agreement. And so it's one of the final things that's part of a jigsaw puzzle around how the voluntary market, how that interacts with national targets and the like. Some are saying those voluntary purchases shouldn't be rewarded to governments, particularly with governments, not just Australia, not having enough ambition, and that those should be netted off them. There are actually going to be issues if other companies buy in country. So there are issues, for example, like Microsoft purchasing credits here in Australia. Now they've done that with pre-2020 credits in their latest investment, but this is a very live issue and one which we'll be continuing to track carefully.
All right. Thank you very much, John. And once again, thank you to all our last lot of guest speakers. It was fantastic.